So we will call the meeting of the Policy Committee to order. And first we'll welcome Tony Thompson to the committee and the board.
Thank you.
Good to have you. And the first thing that I need to, and I never remember to get the text in front of me. I need to re-invoke the resolution or confirm the resolution that adopting procedures for public meetings. Do you think that's been sufficiently covered, or do I need more specific language?
Well, it was in the May 18th meeting,
Okay.
Mike. So if anybody wants to look back and see it, then they can.
Okay, great. That's great for the record. Okay, so the first order of business then is to review the sort of updated and reworked draft of the policy 1.6, which was originally unsolicited gifts of non-library materials. But you'll see now the draft proposal is that it just changes to gifts of non-library materials. So there was a really good discussion last month where we got kind of poked away at it and uncovered a number of surrounding issues. The main new issue there was sort of there were kind of two main issues that came up, which were the concept that some gifts end up coming with restrictions, and that there should be probably a more formal or way of something in place to ensure that those restrictions are retainable and so forth. And then the second thing was that JMRL also, or at least entities on the library's behalf, solicit gifts sometimes, and it's good for those to go through to have some centralized control in some sense. David, relayed to me an example. I don't think it was in last month's meeting, but where the library, a branch manager or someone at a branch might apply for a particular grant that has a limit of how many times it can be applied for per year, and maybe someone else in the system had an idea of applying for a bigger grant from that same organization. And if those aren't coordinated, then they can sort of, stomp on each other's toes or get in conflict. So the draft language you're looking at kind of addresses those topics. Right after the meeting, Marcy had sent in some suggested language, which was super helpful. So thank you for that. And that basically what you see, the first half, what you see mostly incorporates those. But then I did go back and re-watch the meeting, which was very convenient to have that back for reference. And then David and I discussed and have come up with this draft to kind of cover everything that we think came up in last month's meeting or got onto the table from last month's meeting.
Mike, do you want me to screen share
Oh yeah, please do, yeah. So you should all have it from prior emails and also the meeting handouts for today. But yes, let's look at it together. I guess I can just read it because it's short enough. So the acceptance of, so it's gifts of non-library materials, which now has kind of two paragraphs that cover unsolicited and then solicited. So it says the acceptance of unsolicited gifts of money or other non-library materials may be subject to approval by the Library Board of Trustees at the discretion of the director. Donors of these gifts may suggest uses limited to a specific purpose or location prior to acceptance, but any restrictions must be acknowledged in advance by a written agreement between the donor and the library. Once accepted, the gifts become the property of the library. Undesignated gifts will be used by the library board in any way it deems appropriate. And then the new section, in order to ensure alignment with JMRL priorities, gifts that are solicited on behalf of the library by staff, friends of the library, or fundraising organizations should be approved in advance by the library director. And I'll just make a note, we don't technically control what a fundraising organization or a friend of the library or a private individual might do, but this at least is a written way of expressing our preference, that those organizations work through the director. So that's why the word should is used there. Any thoughts, comments, questions, open for discussion?
I was not at the October meeting. I'm sorry about that. But I guess my only concern is that, does this apply to, so there's no like monetary limit or minimum stated here. So like even a gift of $50 or something like that, would need to follow these rules. Is that right?
Go ahead, David.
Carla, that came up when Mike and I were discussing it, and JMRL staff have procedures for accepting small donations where basically every small donation becomes a buy a book donation. So if something under a few $100s comes in, then staff accept it, send a thank you, and use it for the book collection. So I think the wording there, because Mike and I did discuss that when we were working on this, I think the wording allows for some leeway there.
Okay.
May be subject to approval at the discretion of the director.
Okay. And even a gift in kind, I'm just thinking like maybe it's not a book that's being donated, but it might be a service that's being donated, or other types of materials, but printing maybe, that's being donated.
I think this covers most of those because we talked about, if you've been in Northside recently, you've seen the beautiful origami paper crane sculpture hanging in the children's room. That was a gift of a family that it's beautiful. It's huge. And we went through quite a bit in order to get it in and get it installed during COVID. But that was in my mind when Mike and I were working on this. So I think that this allows for non-monetary gifts as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe something small, something smaller that would come through might not need to be reviewed by you.
So Carla, let me say, I think the intent here, and tell me if the language covers it, is that the director basically has the discretion of how to handle any of these gifts. And then he may bring it to the board if he feels it's important or necessary. So one thing that was a part of the discussion in the meeting was, should there be a definition of when the director must bring something to the board? And we ended up deciding no. I mean, David described some of the rules the guidelines he might use, but we decided not to kind of officially put that into the policy. But I think all the cases you're mentioning are covered by discretion of the director, meaning he, at a procedural level, kind of decides how to handle those.
And is that happening right now? Like basically, if anything is being given to us, are you alerted of that, David, or?
It's mostly monetary gifts that happen at a branch level, and the branch managers aren't telling me every time somebody gives $10 or says keep the change or whatnot. But I have access to that through our cash reports, like through Jerry, basically, because there's an accounting aspect to money that comes in. For non-monetary donations, I think I'm only made aware of them. So we're not talking about like volunteer hours and things like that.
But a professional service.
Yeah, I think I'm only made aware of something if it's unusual. And I would think something like that would be unusual. So if somebody came in and said, I want to volunteer to, clean your windows or something like that.
Or provide graphic services.
Graphic service, sure.
Yeah.
They would speak to me about it. And we have reached out to graphic service is a great example because I can think of in the past working on some large programs where JMRL has reached out to individuals to ask if they would make an in-kind donation. And that would kind of fall under the second paragraph there about solicited gifts, where we went out and asked somebody like, hey, would you do this in kind? But yeah, I don't have any concerns about that. Basically, it doesn't come up often. But if somebody were to, most services we would consider volunteer work, and it would be covered by the volunteer policies and procedures. But if it were something like somebody clearly wanted to make a gift, or somebody wanted to gift somebody else's service, I want to gift you this. I'm going to pay for this graphics work. Then managers would alert me of that.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think I would point out if David, for example, establishes a procedure whereby branch managers, if you get a gift under some threshold, say $100, and tells them how to handle it yourself by adding it to buy a book or whatever, then that has been covered at the director's discretion because he put that in place. In other words, I think discretion of the director covers him delegating that, in defined circumstances, down where he doesn't have to look at every single thing.
Okay.
Mike and David, I see the friends are mentioned in the second paragraph, my most recent gig. Do we have, and forgive me if it's been covered before, do we have a liaison, or is this published to them so that they know that they need to do that? That the friends need to basically get the sign off before we go out and do that?
I thought you were the liaison, Tony.
Yeah.
We have had a liaison in the past. Jane Cool fulfilled that role, and we have had liaisons the other way, like Pearl sat on the 5-year plan committee. But I think this would be more in communication between myself and the Friends Board president. And again, as Mike pointed out, it doesn't, JMRL cannot force the Friends to do anything here. It would more be a matter of, we would like to know, and I already am aware of those things from attending all the Friends Board meetings.
Okay, good. That just I want to make sure. Yeah, that sounds like covered. We're covered.
Well, I think it's a great point that the line of communication should be there for things that involve the Friends, and it sounds like it is at some level.
Yeah, and having David at every meeting, I think
Sure,
we always dumped on David whenever he came, so that works out well.
And there's also, so there's kind of the Friends Endowment, and then third-party fundraising groups, which we have quite a few of. Like Marcy is well versed in the Grow Nelson Library, which just sprung up in the last year or so. But there are also non-regional Friends groups, such as Ginny's got a Green Friends of the Library organization that serves it's its own 501c3 and has served to support the library there. There's the Louisa Library Foundation. So we've got quite a few small pockets like that do support the library, and the wording here allows us to say to them, like, hey, don't forget to let us know if you're planning on spending money for the library. Not that that's an issue, but it could be. So it's good to cover it.
Okay, if there's no further discussion or wording suggestions or wordsmithing, I'd like to move forward to get and recommend this to the full board. Do we take committee votes on that? Or I'm trying to remember, or do we just kind of establish consensus?
Just by consensus.
Okay, so are there any, do we have a consensus to go forward? All right, I'm seeing nodding. I'm not hearing any nays or further wordsmithing. Okay, so we can move on. So the next item for today is policy 4.232, conduct at JMRL. And David, are you able to put the current policies on the screen?
Sure.
And my goal for today is not to wordsmith or rewrite this, but just basically open it up for discussion. For branch managers in particular, I'd like to get input into, I think David has already done some of that, finding out what needs to be added. And then behind the scenes, David had also reached out to library directors and got some favorites from other directors around the state. And I just had a meeting, there's one of those that ends up as my favorite just from a very quick skim. But David, did you have anything to, were you able to look at those?
I skimmed similarly. So I put out the call to all the directors in the state to ask if anybody had any conduct policies that they particularly liked or found very useful, and got a response of there were about 10 or 15 collected here, I think. Not even that many.
Yeah.
9 of them. So can I give a brief little bit of additional background there, Mike?
Yeah, please.
So the reason that this made it onto the policy committee's radar this year is that I was interested in adding some language about, so where we have disorderly conduct here, that's pretty vague and hard to define and hard for staff to point at sometimes, and becomes a point of contention about what's disorderly and what's not. So staff are interested in adding language to say something along the lines of what you're doing should not be interfering with others' use of the library. So that's the impetus here, was to add that language, something similar to that. And then also, when we did away with the fines and fees policy last month, when the board voted to remove that, the staff was looking for a place to land language about copyright violation and making sure that patrons understood that the responsibility for not violating copyright falls on them. And it was a suggestion from Mike to add that here, which I like. And then when this got opened up to JMRL managers to look at and talk about, they brought up some specific concerns, which we may or may not want to get into down the road, as Mike said, after we've looked at some sample policies, but one of which was odor, and the other was the bottom line here about service animals. Those are 2 kind of frequent conduct issues that they would like to see at least discussed by this body.
I noticed that in one of the policies from around the state, there was, it delineated in great detail the level of offense and how many times you had to basically breach the code of conduct before you were evicted permanently type of thing. And while I thought that was a good idea, I thought that was a little bit, didn't leave enough to the imagination, as it were. That was one of the things I noticed from, I think, at least two of the different libraries around the state.
Yeah, Richmond in particular, I think, is one of those.
Yeah.
And I agree, it's too detailed. At the same time, I think I would add two things along those lines to this list, which is, and David, if you can scroll to the bottom, let's see if it's already here. Just something that says here are, okay, there's failure to comply. Yeah, maybe that's good enough. But just a comment that's, there might, what the consequences would be if you're not able to comply with the conduct. But the second half of that is, I think something we've added in other cases, the same principle might apply here, is what is the appeal, at least a mention of some sort of appeal process for someone who, believes that they've been penalized incorrectly. In other cases we've used this concept of a reconsideration form, which is more for programs and
Offerings.
Yeah, I don't know if the reconsideration form would work for this, but there is a reconsideration policy that kind of describes an escalating sequence of appeal options.
Right.
And I think that principle would apply here in some way.
Yeah, I think the steps of it, in fact, Mike, would work. I agree that this doesn't belong there, but the steps are basically appeal to the library director, and if you're unhappy with that appeal to the library board.
Yeah. So I would put on the table adding those concepts somehow. Ideally, it would just be a reference out to to this, but we'd have to look at reconsideration and see if it really covers it as it's written right now.
Okay.
I mean, the options would be rework reconsideration a little bit to make it more broad to cover this case also, or essentially duplicate the effort by putting some of those steps down here. But I'd like to at least invoke the idea that people do have an appeal options and how that would work.
Right.
Okay. And then the other thing, and this is just somebody just sits down and wordsmiths. I just would like to rethink the tone generally. I'm seeing in Montgomery Floyd, it says the purpose is to ensure that library facilities provide a welcoming climate of respect and comfort for library patrons and staff. I think that's a little more of a positive approach. Then to provide an atmosphere conducive to proper use, JMRL requires the public to comply with the following rules. We could say the same thing in a more welcoming way, I think. So that's just a concept I wanted to bring out.
I agree with that.
And even with number one, this is prohibited. These are improper. I think we can get the same thing across by saying, here's what you should do, rather than this is what you must or may not do.
Everybody's watching my note, but I'm making a note.
Yeah, that's good. David, maybe you could pull up Botetourt County from that was my favorite in terms of, and I would say in general, I'd like to have the nitty gritty of the rules, but I also like to surround them with a little bit of context. And that first paragraph in our current does attempt to do that, but this is really nice level of context in my opinion. You don't want to get too wordy because then people.
I think you want something that's one page. Is that what you're about to say, Krista? Because it gets posted in various places as well.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Now,
So
once it gets too long, it gets a little difficult to, use it on a regular basis like we do the current one.
Right.
I was looking at Norfolk's, and I think they have 19 points on theirs, and it just goes on and on and on.
Right.
The happy medium.
Well, so Krista, let me ask about that. So certainly you could almost cover it with one principle, right? Which is you can't behave in a way that interferes with other people's use of the library. That would almost, but at the same time, I suspect that as a branch manager, that could lead to a difference of interpretation by a particular patron. Well, I don't think I'm violating the principle. So at that point, you do need some details that say, well, specifically, I'm just looking at this first thing. You were yelling and screaming, okay, and we've specifically said that's not okay. Am I correct, Krista, in thinking that you definitely need to kind of specifically detail kind of the most common cases at least?
Right, we do. And I think, over years of use, this has worked for us, especially when we can say if, you're disrupting other people's use of the library. But it has been helpful to specifically have things like smoking, leaving your bags unattended. There's some things that come up pretty often here. And like I said, I did look at other libraries, peer libraries, and what their policies are. And they just go on. And I think, like I said, there's a happy medium.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm taking away the idea that we shouldn't, just length, but I understand balance between, I guess you're saying you don't have a list of things that you're identifying that we should add. Certainly I'm not hearing that.
Right. I mean, like I said, I looked at some others, like Norfolk says, no unlawful behavior, which is a long list of things that are generally illegal anyway. We don't go into that kind of detail on ours because we don't generally need to. And this has worked for us over the years with a few adaptations as we need to modernize things like adding vaping as a smoking device.
I forgot about that. Right. Vaping.
Right.
Yeah, I got to say, when I pulled this up, folks, I said, this looks very familiar. I don't think this has changed very much in 10 years. So
You know what the changes are? Food or drink was removed because that used to be on here.
Mhm.
And replaced with number 4 here. Covered drinks are permitted. Managers did have some questions about, they didn't like that hot foods are prohibited, and they suggested some wording for that. And there was something else, Tony. I can't remember what it was, but there was something else that's been added.
Cell phones, because initially
cell
we
phones,
didn't
right.
allow people to use cell phones at all. And then we found out that we needed to let them use the phones, but they need to be considerate.
Right. Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah, exactly. So,
And both of those were big kind of changes in the day-to-day operations of the library that the board discussed at length at the time, and the patrons had very strong feelings about one way or the other, both the cell phones and the eating.
Yep.
So if those aren't addressed, those need to be addressed somewhere specifically, Mike, I think. Number 4 and number 3 here. So I agree with Krista. I mean, this has worked for the most part. I would like to broaden the disorderly conduct, maybe add the copyright violation. And I absolutely agree with you on work on the tone of it in general.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm hearing is this mostly serves our needs. I'm interested in basically taking a stab at maybe rewriting the whole thing to cover all the exact same points with the additions, but in a different with a different approach. And we'll see whether I'm able to be successful with something like that.
I also like body tots, but it's clearly not designed to have on display somewhere.
Yeah.
Just as Krista mentioned.
Very long.
Yeah. Although
No,
covers a lot.
but you know what? Does anyone ever look? I mean, we may hand people a policy if we're having trouble with somebody, but people never in my branch look at it on the wall. It's been there for a bazillion. No one ever looks at it.
At Central, it's posted in the restrooms and at some tables, and staff frequently can point to it because the question comes up like, well, where does it say I can't X, Y, or Z? And it has come in handy at Central to be able to point to that and say, here's where it says you can't X, Y, Z.
Got it.
conceptually, in my mind, it could be possible to have a detailed policy and then have a one-page summary of that you
Sure.
you know, for operational use. It doesn't have to be an either or. But I also agree if there's not shorter is better unless there's some, you know, specific reason to make it to be more detailed.
They also have this appeals process in Botetourt. That's nice.
Yeah, but for us, that's not as critical unless they've actually been banned from the library, right? I mean, and you have that in the letter you send them.
Yeah, and it's individual contact with each patron. So basically our steps when it comes to violation of this policy are staff ask the person to cease whatever behavior it is that's violating. If they refuse, then staff asks them to leave for the day. And then after that, and each of those is documented. And after that, there's some sort of interaction with me where we decide on, you know, what's appropriate based on the severity of the violation. And I always let them know, you know, you can make an appointment to discuss this with me at any point. But Mike's right, you know, if somebody's not happy with my decision, then they can absolutely come to the library board. But if it's not spelled out somewhere, then how are they going to know?
Yeah, that would be, Chris, an example of where I start to wonder, I start to feel maybe it is useful to have that in a written policy that you can refer to from the policy manual, but doesn't need that certainly wouldn't need to be on the one pager, you know, here things to know.
So Mike, you're proposing then to review and develop a one-page summary that would be useful on a point-by-point, case-by-case basis, and add to it maybe something that would go into the policy manual as an addendum for grievance about decisions? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I'm sort of, yes, but let me rephrase it a little bit. I'm thinking we could develop a, whatever we think is the best conduct policy at whatever level of detail we think is appropriate for inclusion in a policy manual. And that would include something like this appeal process, and it's available in the policy manual for reference sort of on the web. And then to the extent that that might be too long or not suitable for posting that whole thing on the, you know, tables in Central Library, we make sort of a one-pager, you know, FAQ, or here's what you know, here's what you need to know, or use in the library, and it would just have the high points, you know, say something, here are excerpts from the policy conduct, and at the bottom it would just have a link for the whole thing. You can go here, but here's what you need, you know, here are the high points that you need to know to use the library today.
Sorry, I stopped the screen share because Kathy just emailed me that she's trying to get in and having some issues. We do that with other, you know, we have a sign up that says no food or drink or no smoking, you know, that right. It's from the policy itself, but doesn't necessarily refer to the rest of the policy.
Yeah, in general, I think it wouldn't hurt, David, to have a little on a sign like that, a small defined print at the bottom.
Right. As more policy.
For more information, go here, because it's kind of, it just further buttresses the question of, hey, where is this written down? You know, where is this written?
So should we, Mike, do you want you and I to work on that and bring it back?
Yeah, that would be my plan. But today, I just wanted to get everything on the table. And as much as I wish that we were able to meet in person, this recorded meeting actually serves as a pretty handy reference to go back, hey, what did we talk about, and get on the table. So, you know, speak now if there are especially operational stuff that we want to get included. And I know, and again, I know you have that in the draft some of the edits that you've
Yeah, and
already
some of this we likely want to run by JMRL's attorney as well.
Yeah.
The service animals one in particular, this comes up quite a bit at every location. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ginny and Krista, but this happens every once in a while where someone will come in with an animal and staff are unclear. If there's not enough, every year or so, I'll send out that I've just basically cut and pasted from my predecessor some procedures for this, but you know, staff are only really allowed to ask 2 questions of somebody who claims to have a service animal. Is that a service animal, and what service are they providing? And it really doesn't matter what the answers are. The answer from the staff, if they say, yes, it's a service animal, can't be, you can't have that in here. So I think more than anything, maybe this is just a staff education issue and maybe not a policy committee issue, but it would be good to get some further clarification on that.
We've also had more instances of people, and I've even noticed this at the grocery store, people who either wear their animals like a baby, or they have them in a container. So they figure as long as it's contained somehow in their backpack, in their, wrapped around their body. I did a double take in Kroger the other day because we saw a little dog that was kind of wrapped around its owner's body, and I was like, in the grocery store. But anyway, and that's a separate issue, but it comes up frequently because they're not saying it's a service animal. They're saying, I'm bringing my animal in because I don't want to leave it in the car, and as long as I can contain it, it shouldn't matter to anybody else. So that's a whole separate issue that's been coming up more often because, they can take their dogs to Lowe's and other places. So I guess they think they can bring them to the library. What do you think, Tony?
As somebody who has been known to put a certain 15-pound dog in a stroller and take him around and about, I know that people try that. Well, he's in a stroller, he's locked in, obviously it's not going to be a problem. My feeling about that is you're abusing the goodwill of the business. If the sign on the door says pet friendly, great, okay. But I know there are plenty of them, like the library, that say service animals only. And I whether you're wearing it or pushing him in a stroller, I think it's beyond the bounds of civility. But that's just me.
But it comes up, and the staff, need direction on that too, which is that unless it's a service animal, it shouldn't be in the library.
Right, and I've noticed recently that airlines now have wider latitude in saying, no, you cannot have an emotional boa constrictor with you on the flight. I'm sorry.
It has to be a dog for airlines now, I believe.
So what do we want our policy or rule to be, and does
Well,
what we have right now cover it?
I think we just want to make sure that it's current with current legislation, and then provide, and maybe, Mike, this doesn't even belong in policy. Maybe we need a separate procedure here for staff instead of a reminder from me periodically or answering when the question comes up, someplace that they can turn that says, here are the steps that you should take if an animal comes in the building, like a flow chart almost.
But I guess what I'm getting at is if our again, maybe you can scroll down to that. I was hoping that we'd be able to get Kathy in, but yeah, it says animals are not, So is this what we want the policy to be, aside from any enforcement issues? It sounds like the answer is yes.
Yeah, I don't think that we want to allow animals because we have a lot of patrons that do not, we have a lot of people that don't want animals in the library while they're in the library.
Well, there are also problems of allergy and that sort of thing that are quite legitimate.
Yes. Very
Well,
much.
so I'm just looking over to your notes on the side, and Marcy, this would be an instance of the same principle, which is it was one person's use of a service animal in some way, impeding another person's use of the library. And I guess it would go to, are we able to legally make that?
Right. Would we call that either disorderly conduct or violating whatever the new wording is, saying don't disrupt others' use of the library? And the point that staff made to me was that if it's growling, it's likely not a service animal. They go through intensive training in order to.
But it goes back to the legal question of how do you on an enforcement day by day determine what it is or is not?
I think maybe the clarification staff need is between support animal and service animal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because our policy does not allow support animals, which would be the boa constrictor that Tony mentioned.
Right, and that came up here recently, David. I don't know if you remember when we had a gentleman here on the 3rd floor, And 3 of us ended up out in the elevator lobby because the dog was yipping and growling and carrying on. And when we asked the gentleman, he had come into the ID program. And when we asked him about the animal, he said the animal was acting that way because we were confronting him about the animal's behavior, and the animal was acting protective. And it was a support animal, not a service animal. He explained to us that he had PTSD and he had all sorts of issues, and that's why the animal was acting the way it was. But, you know, when you hear it yelping out in the lobby, it's kind of, you know, disruptive.
The other note from staff here is that they want to know if we can have language saying that, you know, the animal can't do X, Y, and Z or impede use of the library services for others. And
Yeah, if that's legal, I would be in favor of being more explicit than not about that point.
What you can do is add trained service animals because that implies that there is some sort of certification process and education process for the animal. And obviously an animal that is barking and growling and threatening.
So Marcy, but I would just say on a day-by-day basis, so the patron claims that it's trained, but it's behaving in a way that's impeding other. I think we don't care if it's actually trained, we just care if it's impeding the other.
But I think you just say that all service animals must be well behaved. I mean, that's what, you know, you're really asking of the person and their animal. And if you require the animal to be on a leash, then we should say that as well.
Yeah, maybe David make a note there, just some questions. Could we put the word well behaved there? Because that might cover that behavior in a concise way. And can we put the word leashed there?
I know it's not exactly the same thing, but you know, all of the wineries that allow animals still require, and they use this language, that the animal be well behaved. And then some of them do say that the animal needs to be leashed. Not everybody requires a leash, but they do require the well behaved. And not just the wineries. Any attraction with children and animals are allowed. They do use that word, well behaved.
Yeah, I like it. So I think it sounds like, David, this was one where we would need to get the lawyer we'd make sure that it sounds like there is existing legislation here that we would need to make sure we're comply with. But
okay. Yeah, and we can check with our peers again to see if there's consensus on how this is handled by the libraries in the state.
Okay, good. Okay, but well behaved and leashed to me sound like good clarifications here. Okay, anything else to get on the table with conduct?
You know, I just have one thing, and I don't know if this is a problem anywhere in JMRL, but you know, if you have something in your policy, you're supposed to enforce it, but there are things in here that I think really aren't being enforced, like on number 2, cell phones, ringers must be turned off. You almost never. If we said something to everyone whose cell phone rang in the library, that's all we would get done. So it's, unless somebody's cell phone is repeatedly really a disruptive thing, and then of course you say something. But I mean, we just don't really enforce that. And I wouldn't want to, because it seems really unfriendly to me. Cell phones are just so ubiquitous now. We still have people who don't know how to mute their cell phone, and people who, you know, people just don't think about it. Their cell phones are constantly with them. And I think that's kind of unfriendly. And I would also worry that there could be someone in the library who is actually bullying patrons by running over and then asking someone to leave if their cell phone rings twice. I don't know that that's happening, but I think it's a possibility.
I mean, Jenny, we can look at that. I agree with you that most cell phones don't even really ring; they just vibrate.
No one pays any attention.
I can't wait for the day when we actually get to enforce these policies again, right? When this is a problem.
Right.
Oh, and right now we are back to no food and drink. I mean, you know.
Temporary COVID measures, but right, that
Yeah.
no food or drink is in force right now.
Well, I got to say, in the historical context, I remember this discussion about sleeping in the library and what a long, sort of torturous way it was to get that in the policy. And we didn't want to make the library staff police that constantly, go around, basically waking people up as if they were on a park bench or something like that. And I know that's an issue, especially at Central back in the day. And again, as Ginny says, you don't want to put the library staff in the position of doing nothing but enforcement because they have other jobs to do. So.
Well, it just looks really unfriendly, Tony. If somebody is stretched out at your computer station and they're asleep, or if someone is actually stretched out on furniture, we would say something. But like if kids are lying in the stacks, unless they appear to be bothering someone, we don't go running over and tell them they can't do that.
Yeah.
And also, I have patrons who are volunteers and they're older, and sometimes they read a little after they've volunteered, and they might doze off. I'm not going to go over there and, knock on the door and say, hey, you can't sleep in here. We just don't do it.
Right.
It's regarded as very unfriendly.
I think that the wording covers that, Ginny, and I'm
Yeah.
guessing that Tony could
Yeah.
to the many hours of discussion about it. But it does say basically currently it says inconsistent with or disruptive of the normal use of library facilities. So like
Right.
even if there was a child lying in the aisle, I would expect staff to go tell the parent like, hey, we need to keep the aisle clear.
Mm-hmm.
Except if there's no one in the library but them,
Sure. Okay. There's always an exception, but in general, like we're more worried about the disruption to others than policing the behavior there.
Yeah. And I also think our food policy is not very modern. The policies that I looked at, to me, it seems like libraries mostly allow food. And I saw one policy that I liked that said food, if not messy, sticky, or aromatic, is permitted in the library. That dry snacks thing, I've never thought that really worked very well. People can make an enormous mess with dry snacks. It's not whether they're dry or not, it's whether people are being respectful of the environment in the library. When I was in library school back in Indiana quite a few years ago, I ate my lunch in the library every day after doing an internship, and it was not questioned at all. I just think.
So I'm hearing the theme that it's the principle that we're trying to get at, which is you should make sure that what you're doing isn't going to have a bad impact on others. But I also think it's probably the case that we come back to you're going to need something specific to point to in cases where the individual patron's interpretation of that concept might not be the same as yours. But I think you're right that we can probably look at some of these other examples and get some better language for food that incorporates those. I do think you have an interesting point, which is if something is just unenforceable, should it be in here? And on some level, you want it there as you probably want it there as a backstop. But yes, I do take your point about being too heavy-handed with, don't do this, don't do this. I think some of that may be able to be addressed with the tone that I'm hoping to improve.
But I do think that different branches run into consistently, they run into different problems, right?
Yep.
And they know what is consistent for their branch, right? So we do need to have one policy that covers, all of those problems. And, maybe it is Central that has a population where these things might come up more often, shoes and shirts and, animals, and I don't know, basically living in the library, using the library as a hangout of, a rec room sort of place. So I do think it's important that we hear from all the managers and their suggestions about what problems they regularly see, and then how enforceable is it?
I think that you hit the nail on the head there, Carla. A lot of these specifics probably came from years of experiences at the main library. But yeah, managers have reviewed this and talked about it, and it was mostly additions of a few things and a little bit of tweaking. There was some talk about the food policy, and people wanted to remove hot from the second caveat there. So I think that
It's really about messy.
Yeah, that's Jenny's point, right? That it's more about the disruption or messy or I mean,
Messy and oat.
loud food too, smelly, things like that. So I think that if we looked at it from the point of view that we want to improve the tone and get to the point where the behavior is not interfering with others' use, then we can come up with some good wording.
Okay. In 2 months, you'll see a beautiful proposal of some sort, and then we'll, if we need further iteration, then we can take another cycle if we need to. Okay. Anything else we want to get on the table here? Okay. So then we'll move to the next, the final kind of point for today, which is we've been talking about the idea, a process of moving toward a kind of a dedicated personnel manual, which sort of started with the idea of reorganizing the current policy manual and moving some employee-specific policies into their own dedicated space, and then realizing, hey, those are pretty sparse compared to what many small businesses have, and we rely on the Charlottesville manual, but then looking at that in detail and noticing, well, that's mostly logistical HR type stuff, and there's really nothing that's department specific or even addresses how, for example, personnel might interface with the public or interact with the public, and so forth. So we're moving toward a goal of having a dedicated personnel manual. The current, and so the past steps, just as a recap, we did meet with the Charlottesville HR manager and sort of confirmed from her that it would be normal and usual for departments to supplement the base Charlottesville HR manual with department specific policies. So she had no conflict or didn't feel there would be any conflict with the library, taking some steps in that direction. And then this past month, David and I looked at some other kind of an informal sampling of just what I could find on a quick search of other public library personnel manuals. And we sort of bounced those off of our public library consultant at the state library to say, hey, are these the right practice? Are any of these are all of these examples good one, in the right territory for us to be looking at? Are there, in particular, we wanted to explore from the state library's expertise, are there any topics, and I'm thinking of, day-to-day workplace type of topics that should be internal procedures only rather than covered by policy? And she essentially confirmed that the examples we had were the right kind of scope. So if anyone's curious about those particular examples that I bounced past, just email me and I'll send you those links or the attachments. But essentially, the selection of manuals were essentially, almost all of them in their introduction or something at the end described them as a trustee document that was a trustee policy. Most of the ones we saw were definitely more comprehensive or sort of broader in scope than what JMRL has in writing right now. And we kind of got that validated at the state library level. So I think the next step would be to convene. It's probably not there's a lot of detailed work here if we're going to come up with a list of things that we don't really have covered as far as personnel policy right now, and then work towards fleshing those out into specific policies. So I'd like to suggest or propose that we have a working group that would be a couple of trustees. 2 might be the right number, but certainly if more people are interested, we can have more. Plus staff members who are interested. Obviously, this is going to have to get going to involve a lot of staff input, but again, there has to be somebody, a couple people who are rolling up their sleeves and actually getting things into shape where we can even start to get that input. The working group would start by continuing this idea of looking at example manuals, taken from those, just identifying topics, basically what the table of contents would look like, and then we would start drafting text for each of those. We do need to, when we get to that text step, kind of be careful on a case-by-case basis to make sure we're striking the right balance of level of detail in terms of articulating some principles that we want accomplished by each policy versus how much detail needs to be left then to a procedural level versus spelled out at a sort of a policy document level. But there's a couple steps before we get there, which, namely getting the list of topics together. So any thoughts or comments about that approach? And if that sounds good, I'll volunteer to be on the working group, but if anybody else is particularly interested, the floor is open. Tony's raising his hand. Okay.
When you say staff members, you mean beyond the staff members that are already on this policy committee?
Well, I'm thinking of this as a working group. So it's sort of, the working group will go roll up their sleeves and bring what their work products to the policy committee, and then before it gets to the board. So in other words, not every staff member who is on the policy committee now needs to be in the working group. And conversely, it could be anybody in the system who's not already on the policy committee, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'd want broad, both regional representation and also the hierarchical representation too.
But I would say 2,
Not too big, sure.
2 or 3 or 4 would be, I'd say 4 max.
I have to be there.
But I don't think you necessarily, so certainly you want to monitor what's going on, but I don't think this needs to land on you in terms of drafting stuff.
Well, and we had an outline from a while ago, right, that pulled out.
That was more, we had an outline of the reorganization of the policy manual that pulled out the current policies that would land in a personnel manual, but this is what we're talking about now, or what are the things that are not covered.
Right. So we would use that and then put the other pieces in there that aren't covered, right?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but the goal of the working group, really, the main goal is going to be to identify the areas that we need some policy and procedure.
Well, that would be the initial step, but as you start writing, somebody's going to have to come up with initial drafts, and I think that working group would also take that step before it got, when we review, when we do our regular review of JMRL policies, we're always starting with something that's already there. And by definition, we're talking about adding things that are blank slate. And they're not blank slate in the sense that someone else in the world has thought of these, but they're blank slate in terms of that JMRL doesn't have something in writing yet.
But they might have the process in place. They just don't have it in writing.
Yeah,
that's possible also. So I think it's a great point, is that this might be a way to formalize or capture current practices. Yeah, absolutely. If we have practices that we're happy with, but they're just not written down in a way that everyone can.
Or to Carla, to your point, they might be written down for one location but not another, and so we want to make sure that either there's consistency there or that there's a good reason for the inconsistency. That this branch needs this and that branch needs that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, so we have Mike Powers and Tony Townsend from trustees, and David, maybe you can put out the call and in the next week or 2, and we'll figure out who's the right, mix from the staff side. Okay. If that's it, then if there are no further things, we have 2 minutes for any further things. Otherwise, we'll close and let some of these other folks get into the main meeting. Okay, so we'll end the policy committee meeting. Thank you, everyone.